All right, good evening, everybody. Once again, thank you for joining us tonight. We are really excited to welcome this month's speaker, as well as he'll be our speaker for the next couple of months. My name is Clarice Wheeler, and I am the Southern Nevada Programs Coordinator with Friends of Nevada Wilderness. Before we get started, I would just like to respectfully acknowledge that here in Southern Nevada, we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Southern Paiute or Nuuvi people, where our speaker, David, resides, are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Cayuse, Umatia, and Walla Walla tribes. What is now called Nevada is home to 27 federally recognized and countless more not federally recognized tribes of Indigenous peoples. These people are the original stewards of the land and continue to care for our precious natural places to this day. I'd like to invite you to take just a moment to consider the legacies of colonization and how they have brought you here today. So for those of you who might be new to our speaker series, Friends of Nevada Wilderness is a statewide nonprofit focused on protecting wildlands. Wilderness areas are natural landscapes that are largely unaffected by people. We protect these lands in a few main ways. We advocate by speaking up for these lands to get them permanently protected and managed to maintain their wildness. We educate by sharing the values and vision of wilderness at community events, presentations similar to this one, and finding common ground to protect our wildland heritage. And we steward because these lands cannot protect themselves. We work with volunteers on the ground to help monitor, restore, and improve access to these special places. We hold this Wild Speaker Series every first Thursday of the month by hosting a local environmental expert for people who are interested in learning more about the outdoors and ways to get involved with conservation efforts. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. David Lukas is a speaker, writer, and naturalist who has led thousands of walks, talks, classes, workshops, and tours, including more than 10 years working as a prolific hiking guide and educator in Yosemite National Park. He will be our speaker for the next few months through April in a special 4-part series about bird biology and birding in the Sierra Nevadas. Just a few housekeeping notes before we jump in. If we begin to have any bandwidth issues, I'm going to turn off everybody's cameras so that our speaker can come through clearly. Please keep yourself on mute if you are not speaking. And please drop your questions in the chat. Feel free throughout the presentation, and then we will address them at the end. If you have any comments as well, we'd love to hear them, even if they're not questions. And with that, I'll pass it off to you, David. Oh, David, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Does that work? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. That's a great start. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I really love talking about the natural world, and I love talking about birds. And I have been a freelance naturalist my whole life, and I have focused on just exploring the natural world every day, researching everything, and then sharing what I learned through classes, workshops, books, articles, etc. Let's see, is this doing full screen? Okay. Oops. Does that work?
We can see the Zoom screen, but not your PowerPoint.
It worked for us a second ago, so why isn't it working now? Sorry about that. Stop share. So we just did this as a test run. Let's try this again. So you're not seeing it, huh?
We can see it now for sure.
Oh, okay. So you're seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll just go ahead and do this then. So tonight we're going to talk about birds and the underlying structures of birds. This is a fascinating subject. And let's see, just a second. I am just seeing the PowerPoint presentation on my end, so it's kind of hard because I can't even see myself. So why is that? Let's go back to Zoom. Okay, so I'm doing screen share. Sorry about all this. Maybe I need to be in speaker view. Does that work?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the feedback. It's still in presenter view, but that's okay because I can see it. As long as I can maneuver around, that's all that matters to me. So we're going to talk about birds and the underlying structures of birds tonight. And what a great subject, because we see birds, but everything is hidden underneath feathers. So we don't really understand what's going on with them underneath the surface. And there is a lot of really fascinating things that we'll talk about today. The illustrations in my talk come from two main books, which I find to be really fascinating and useful resources that have been with me my whole life as I'm learning and studying birds. And they're especially good because they're full of excellent illustrations, so I highly recommend them. I'm also using different images off the internet also. So to start, there's about 10,000 species of birds in the world. And what's remarkable about them is that they're all basically the same size and shape. You know, they're all smaller than a football, mostly, have the same basic shape. And what's remarkable is if you compare this to, say, mammals come in a tremendous variety of shapes. So you can look at, a whale, giraffe, or a shrew here. How do you even begin to compare them? They're so different in size and scale and how they're built. And even if you look at fish which fly basically like a bird, except they're flying in water, are completely different between a manta ray, guppy, lamprey, many other forms. So birds are basically all the same shape. So why is that? It's because they're all dealing with the constraints of flight, which is very demanding. And it demands that they reduce their weight drastically. And they do that by eliminating bones and fusing bones. And this is what we're going to be looking at, is how birds' bodies have responded to the demands of flight by changing their bone structure. So if all the birds in the world basically are the same, I mean, there are exceptions, ostrich and penguin, for instance, they're totally different kinds of birds, but the vast majority of birds in the world look just like this American robin that we're used to. They're basically about the same size and shape. So if there's thousands and thousands of species of birds, how do they separate themselves out? And there's three ways that birds can do that don't add weight. One would be their songs. Birds all use different songs. Color, birds have different color patterns. And then the third one, which is really interesting, that doesn't add any weight, is their beak. So if you look at the beaks of birds, there are a tremendous variety of different kinds of bird beak shapes, and beaks weigh almost nothing. So it frees the birds up to modify them in lots of different ways and have very different lifestyles and different diets, so they're not competing with each other. And they're able to do that because beaks do not weigh very much. So if we go underneath the feathers of birds and start looking at the skeletal structure underneath, I want you to keep in mind a couple of basic design principles in birds, which is that they need to lighten the load because it's all about flight for them. They have to find ways to reduce bones, get them to a minimal, because the bones weigh a lot, and they need to figure out a way to compromise and come up with different structures, including the skull. And we'll start at the skull to top here. So what you're seeing in the skull is lots and lots of fusion in bones. You can't even tell where the different bones are because they're all fused. And the thing I noticed right away in the middle of all this complexity is this incredible eyeball. I mean, this is so big. Let's see, maybe I can switch to a pen here. Amazing eyeball right here. The eyeball is so big that the eyes actually meet and smush together in the center of the skull. The birds have gotten rid of the bone here in the middle, and the eyeballs actually push together. The eyes are so big that if you take a bird like a red-tailed hawk, which is about 3 feet tall, they have eyeballs the same size as human beings. The eyes are so important to birds. And the eyes are so huge that the brain is pushed to the back of the skull and put up on its end like an afterthought. It's just smushed into the back of the skull and whatever space is left over to make room for these massive eyeballs. But that doesn't mean that birds are really stupid because they have a little tiny brain. In fact, the eyes are doing a lot of the processing of information for the bird. So imagine a bird is flying through a thicket of branches and it sees a branch coming right at it. The eyes see it. They send a signal to the brain. Brain, what should we do about this branch? The brain thinks about it and says, okay, let's go left. And then the eye looks at where the branch is and moves left. There's no time for that. So the eyes are doing a lot of that processing without sending information back and forth to the brain. So what they've done is they've shifted brain functions, a lot of them, to the eyeball and let the eyeball do a lot of the work for them. But when you look at a bird, you don't see this massive eye, do you? What we see is this little tiny thing. So what's going on here? We're not seeing this huge thing under the surface. Well, birds have a unique bony structure that they only share with dinosaurs, and scientists use it to tell that birds and dinosaurs are related to each other. They have this bony ring around their eyeball. So there's this massive eye back here. And then on top of it is this bony ring holding it down and holding it in place. So basically from the side, what we're seeing is this, the big eyeball tucked into the skull, this bone ring attached to the skin, holding it down and keeping the eyeball from falling out, this giant eyeball. And then what bulges up through this little space is what we see when we see a bird's eye. Something else that is unique about bird eyes is that they're often the side of the head. So in humans, for us, our two eyes are looking forward and it gives us binocular vision. The eyesight overlaps and it gives us depth of field, allows us to tell how far away things is. But we can only see about, say, this far out, and beyond this point, I can't see anything. I just see forward, looking forward with binocular vision. Well, birds have their eyes on the sides, and they're seeing out here to side by side. Each eye is seeing one side and the other side. And it allows them to look for predators coming and to watch out. But with one eye, they have no depth perception. And only in the front, where the eyes overlap, do they have depth perception. So this is, they can see this far, they can see this far. They're seeing this whole area with one eye, this whole area with one eye. And then where they overlap right here is where they have three-dimensional depth perception. And look where those fields of view overlap, right here at the tip of the bill. It's incredible. That means that right at the tip of the bill, their eyes overlap, their vision overlaps, and they can see three-dimensional at the exact point where they need to pick up little seeds, little insects, pull flowers apart, etc., etc. Amazing strategy. Another thing you notice when you look at a skull is there's no teeth. Where are the teeth? Well, let's ask that question. So imagine a bird, and let's add some teeth to it. It's got big old teeth for chewing up food, right? What's the problem with that? Well, every aspect of a bird is focused around flight, which means that they have a center of gravity right here in the center of the body, and everything is balanced around that forwards and backwards. If you look at a bird head on flying at you, this would be the two wings and then the body, and this is the keel where the wing muscles attach here and here. The center of gravity on the bird flying straight at you is right here, dead center. And so the wings can rock from side to side around that pivot point. So if we add heavy teeth to a bird, that's a lot of weight. And what supports heavy teeth? Well, you need heavy bone structure to hold the teeth in place. And what controls heavy bones and heavy teeth would be heavy muscles. So all of a sudden, you add a lot of weight right here for teeth. And then around the pivot point, the head will just crash into the ground. So the only way to balance that out would be to have a lot of weight right here. Well, that does not work. You cannot do that and still fly. So what birds have done is they've taken the function of teeth and moved it into the center of their body to an organ called the gizzard. You're familiar with the gizzards. And gizzards are a hard muscular stomach Birds eat a lot of seeds and gravel, swallow them into the gizzard, and then they pick up food with their little sharp-tipped bills. They swallow the food whole. It goes down into this gizzard, and the gizzard with its hard muscles grinds the food up and acts like teeth. And guess where the gizzard is? Right here in the center of gravity, balancing the bird out. It's really a fantastic place for it. And if you look at a bird head on, the gizzard is right here in the center of gravity, adding weight to that incredible fulcrum point that's so important to birds. Well, there's another really cool thing about their jaws also, and it's the way that the jaws work. So when I always looked at birds, I always thought that birds just drop their lower jaw down, like this gull looks like it's doing right here. But in fact, something far more interesting is happening with the bird jaw. So when they lower their lower mandible here, and that's pulled down by a muscle that's pulling down this lower beak, the end of it goes up like this. So it's pivoting. The tip goes down, the base goes up, and it pivots a really important bone called the quadrat bone in the side of the skull. And there's a pivot point right here. And as this goes up, it pushes on the quadrat bone, and the quadrat bone rises. And as it rises, it pushes another bone called the jugal bone forward like this. And the result of that is the upper beak lifts like this. So you need one muscle to pull down this lower beak, and then through mechanics, it goes through the sequence and the upper beak raises at the same time with no extra muscles needed. It's a really elegant solution to the problem that birds face of reducing weight through muscles and bones. And in fact, when you look at a bird, the upper bill and the lower bill are opening at the same time. You just don't realize it, but they're both flexible and they both open at the same time. So when you take the bird head and add feathers to it, what do we see here? Well, first of all, we got that massive eye that's hidden underneath the surface here. There's a bony ring right here, constraining just this part that we see and holding the eye in place. And then you add a bunch of feathers to it. 80% of the feathers on a bird are on its head. This is where most of the feathers are. One other thing we can see on the head that's really cool is that birds have eyelids that close like ours. They can go to sleep at night and close their eyes. They can shut out the light with their eyes. But if you're flying through branches and stuff and you get something in your eye, you can't close your eyes or get your hand up and wipe it away while you're flying. You need to be able to see, and yet you need to get things out of your eyes. So birds have something called a nictitating membrane. That is a translucent eyelid that goes forwards and backwards like a windshield wiper and cleans and moistens their eye as they fly and allows them to still be able to see without closing their eyelids. So it's a third eyelid that they can see through. Really efficient solution to the problem of not having hands to clean your eyes. So if we go to the wings of a bird, there's a lot going on here. First of all, if we look at the underlying bone structure of a wing of a bird, it's built on the same exact plan as a human arm. We have the same bones in each section right here, same basic proportions, but there's some really significant differences. One is, look at all the bones that we have in our wrists. It gives us this incredible flexibility in our hands where we can do amazing dexterous maneuvers with them. But would that work for a bird? So say, for instance, I'm a bird flying along and my hands are really flexible and I'm like this, like, whoa, this is really hard. I can barely fly. That doesn't work, right? So what birds do is they have, they have simplified all of these wrist bones down to two little bones here with a very limited range of motion. And their hand just goes up and down, up and down, up and down like this. Very simple. So as they're flying, they're just doing this. Very simple motion. They're not wasting energy. They don't need extra muscles to control all of this like we do in our hands. So they've reduced all these bones that would get in the way. And then look at all these finger bones that we have. Well, birds don't need all of that. So they have one finger here. This is one finger. It's the index finger pointing out. They have a rudimentary, tiny little rudimentary bone here of the middle finger and a tiny rudimentary bone from the thumb here. But basically, their entire hand is just one finger sticking out. When you add feathers to it, this is what you're seeing here. So here's the wrist right here, the elbow, and the shoulder. When you look at a bird, you only see, say, this part, because this is the body. Everything here is tucked into the feathers against the body. We're seeing this part sticking out. And if you draw a line through the wrist and then down around the feathers, this divides the wing into the forearm and then the hand, forearm and hand. So everything out here is the hand. And this is where the bird has this propeller that moves it forward. And then the forearm right here is where all the lift is happening, so it keeps the bird in the air. So you can cut like a 1/4 inch of these feathers here and a bird can't fly, because you can't fly with no propeller. But you can remove 40% of the feathers here and a bird can still fly, because if you have a propeller, you don't need all the lift. You can still get by without that. Let's see. So one other thing that they have here is between the wrist here and the shoulder here up against the body is a tendon going across here that connects the wrist, and the shoulder and the wrist are connected by a tendon, and that's very flexible. So as a bird's flying, it can go like this with its wings, and from its wrist to its elbow, it's got some flex here, so it can bounce in the wind and move, and it gives it just a little bit extra flex right there. That's really important to a bird. When you look at a bird in real life, you can see a lot of these features. The shoulder is up here, the elbow is down here, the wrist is up here. So if this is the wrist, this is the hand, and this is the forearm on a bird, neatly divided right at this bend where the wrist is. This is the propeller out here. This is the lift right here. Now, just do a quick aside here on feathers, because we're looking at the feathers. Every feather we're seeing on a bird is called a contour feather. It's noted in having a shaft in the center and veins on either side. This is every feather that you see on a bird. When you look at a bird, you're seeing all of the contour feathers. Contour feathers cover the bird and basically protect it from the elements, protect it from the rain. It's like having a big raincoat on. And then underneath the raincoat are hidden a bunch of these down feathers, which have no central shaft and no Velcro holding the barbs together. And so they just this soft, frilly mass. That's basically a down jacket. So why this is interesting is, so basically a bird is out in the world, it's wearing this big warm down jacket and then a raincoat over the top of it. Birds flying around the world going, wow, this is great. I am so warm. I am so dry. This is fantastic. Oops, I can't feel anything. I'm wearing so many coats, I can't feel anything. So birds have another type of feather called a phyloplume, which are basically just a long shaft with a little tuft at the end, and they stick out all over their body through their feathers. And phyloplumes act like antennae that read what's going on in the world around them. If you cut off their phyloplumes, a bird can't fly, even though it's just these little shafts, because they're telling the bird where its wings are in relation to its body, what the wind speed is, how to move in terms of space. And those are really important feathers tucked in amongst everything else. One other thing I'll mention about feathers, which is really cool and ties into this idea of the bird is trying to reduce weight, right? So every feather is connected to a muscle group and it's connected to nerves. And if you have feathers all over your body, that's a lot of extra muscles, a lot of extra nerves, a lot of extra weight. So what birds do is they clump up their feathers in groups. The stippling here is where feather groups are. And the most of the bird is naked, completely naked. There's no feathers, it's just bare skin. So all the white spots are naked skin. And look how much naked skin there is on this loggerhead shrike and how few feather groups there are. And basically they just do a comb over all the naked parts of their bodies. And it's a way of reducing weight. they don't need all those feathers, so they just have lots of nakedness and just comb over and keep warm with extra feathers that way. So continuing with skeletons, we look at the legs and feet, and again, there's similarity between a human leg and a bird leg, but some really important differences here. One is, look at the human foot with the heel, ankle, and foot bones. We have so many bones here, and in a bird, that is reduced to one single bone. All of those bones are fused. What we're seeing when we look at a bird is basically the body is like this, the knee is hidden up into the feathers. What we see on a bird is the upper leg, the ankle bending, and then a bird is standing on its toes. And in fact, all of these bones are reduced to one bone below the heel, below the ankle. And there's one original foot bone remaining, which is this tiny little speck of a bone right here at the base of the halix. The halix is the big toe, which has been pivoted back. And so that one tiny little bone is all that's left of all the foot and ankle bones. Everything else is just the bird standing on its toes. Very simple structure. Another thing that's happening in their legs and feet, which I think is really fascinating, is that from their knee, they have a big muscle coming down, going over the back of their ankle. It turns into a tendon. The tendon goes down and goes to the tip of each toe. And so when a bird sits on a branch, most birds have 3 toes forward and 1 toe back. So when they sit on a branch, it's 3 toes forward and then 1 toe back, and that's how they grab onto a branch. So when a bird comes and lands on a branch, lands on a branch and grabs on, and then bends down, as it bends, the tendon gets stretched over the back of the ankle, and that stretching pulls the claws in, and it clenches the branch, which means that when a bird comes in to sleep at night, it can land on a branch, sit down, lean back, and the more it leans back, the more the toes just automatically clench up as that tendon is pulled, and they're not going to fall off in the middle of the night as they fall asleep and their head's falling back and they're fast asleep dreaming. They're not going to fall off. And the other way this is used is for like raptors and owls, for instance. So imagine there's an owl sitting up in a tree and there's a little mouse running on the ground and the owl's looking down at it, and the owl jumps off and comes down at it and flying down to catch the mouse. You've seen these incredible photographs of owls with their talons out as they come down, and they come down and the little mouse is on the ground. They come down and they put their claws around it, and then they collapse into it and let the weight of their body squeeze the talons and do the killing blow without having to have big muscles to squeeze and try to kill. They just put their claws around it and then collapse and let this pulling of this tendon tighten their claws with the force of the impact and do the killing blow. Incredible use of that perching mechanism. So let's look at the overall skeleton. And what we're going to see here is a lot of the reduction of bones going on, starting with the spinal cord is really important. All of the bones of the spinal cord, the spine and the pelvis are fused into one huge bone, big bone that's all completely fused and rigid. And the reason for that is, so imagine us, we have a ton of flexibility in our back. We can move like this, do all kinds of movements. But imagine that you were a bird flying and you're like this, like, whoa, this is super hard. My back is not cooperating at all. That does not work. And also what supports all that movement is muscles. If you have a rigid back, you need muscles holding you up. So birds have solved that by having a rigid back, very stiff, and then their wings are out and they're just doing this very simple up and down motion like this with a rigid back as the platform around which everything is built. And they're not wasting energy with a lot of flexibility in their back. Well, that's great, but what about if you want some food? Well, if your whole body is so rigid and you're kind of moving around like this, it's not easy to get food. So birds also don't have hands, so they can't reach out and grab things and bring it to their mouth. So what they've done is they have a lot of vertebrae in their neck, and all the flexibility happens in their neck. So all mammals, regardless of what mammal you're looking at, have 7 vertebrae in their neck. Birds have anywhere from 11 to 25 vertebrae in their neck, which gives them a tremendous amount of maneuverability to reach out into the world and pick things up and turn around and look around, stuff like that, because the rest of their body is a stiff board. And so everything happens in their neck. They also have a little bit of flexibility here in their tail, a couple of loose vertebrae that can move so that the tail here can wiggle or it can act like a rudder in flight. So there's some maneuverability right here also. And then one other thing that we're seeing here is attached to the rigid backbone are the rib cage. So flight is an extremely stressful activity. It puts a lot of stress on the body. You're fighting the wind, you get these massive muscles pulling your wings, and you're fighting the air, you're moving quickly, you're doing all kinds of crazy things. And the ribs are what protect all of your internal organs. So the way to do that is to have big, thick ribs, right? To protect and hold everything together. Well, you can't do that if you're a bird. And in fact, on birds, the ribs are thin and paper-like, very fragile. And what they have is this little finger sticking out on each one called an uncinate process. These little fingers sticking out here on each rib. And basically what's happening is each rib is putting its arms around its neighbors, and all together they hug each other tight and make a rigid little basket as best they can with their thin little ribs. They all hold together tight and they protect all the internal organs during the stresses of flight. So this little tiny finger of bone allows the bird to reduce its ribs down to just this little paper thin bone structure and still protect the ribs. Another thing that the ribs have is, you'll notice on each one, it's hinged right here at the midpoint. And when a bird is flying, it needs a tremendous amount of oxygen because it's using a ton of energy to fly. And so the ribs actually hinge like bellows as the bird is flying. Each wing beat is forcing the ribs to compress on that hinge point, and it pumps oxygen through the bird. And in fact, all the major bones on a bird are hollow and part of the respiratory system, so that oxygen gets pumped in with the bellowing ribs, pumped through all of the bones and back out again to supply the metabolic furnace for the bird as it's flying. And then in a bird's life, it's going to support its weight 2 times. It's going to support its weight when it's standing. So if a bird is just standing and walking on the ground, it's supporting its weight on its legs as it's walking. So they have a broad platform here. The modified pelvis is a girdle. It's a broad platform that leg muscles attached to, tail muscles attached to, and abdominal muscles attached to, and those hold it upright and support its weight while it's walking. The other time birds need to support their weight in their life is when they're flying. So they have the wings out and they're hanging off their wings and they're supporting their weight on their wings. And so they have another big flat bone here called the keel or the sternum. This is where the wing muscles attach to support the wings. So we have these massive muscles that attach the wing bone to the body. And 30% of a bird's weight is these pectoral muscles here. These are massive muscles, 30% of the weight. You think about how important weight is to a bird, and it's willing to devote 30% of its weight to one muscle group, the pectoral muscles. So you have these massive muscles that pull down on wings. Woo, woo, oh, that's great. Got a great beat there. Whoa, okay, that's great. Then how do you lift your wings? Well, you need muscles to lift your wings, right? Well, in order to do that, you would need big muscles up here to pull the wings up, right? Well, that wouldn't work. You can't do that. So birds have come up with an amazing and elegant solution. Underneath these powerful, right here, they have these massive pectoral muscles. You ever, the breast muscles on a chicken when you eat chicken, this massive muscle right here, which pulls the wings down. Underneath it is this thin sheet of muscle called the suprachirocoideus, which comes up, goes through this junction of 3 bones right here. There's a little canal here that it goes through, and it attaches to the top of the wing bone and lifts the wings. Here's another view of it here. So again, here's the massive pectoral muscle pulling down on the wings, woo, woo, like this. And then underneath it is this thin sheet of muscle, which comes up and goes over the top and pulls the wings up like this. So the muscle is down at below. Remember where the center of gravity is? Right here. These muscles are grouped right around the center of gravity in the center of the bird. There's no extraneous muscles up here away from the center of gravity, making the bird lose balance and fight its own weight. In fact, all of the weight is clustered here in the center, and this thin little muscle comes up over the top and lifts the wings up. And this is important for takeoff. You can cut these muscles here and the bird can still fly, but the bird can't take off. So when a bird takes off, it's sitting on the ground, it needs to go up with its wings and then down, up with its wings and then down to take off. That's critical. You need muscles that can pull it up quickly and then pull down. But once you're flying, you're just kind of doing this very simple thing, and you don't need a muscle to do that. And matter of fact, they have a really elegant solution. When you have a chicken for Thanksgiving or Christmas, you know, the wishbone that you get right here, how flexible that is. Well, this takes energy from the wing. So on every wing beat, when you pull down, on the wings come down, the shoulders come together, and this is a paper clip. So basically, you take a paper clip and squeeze it, and that's absorbing the energy of the wings coming down, and it compresses this collarbone, or furcula, wishbone, we call it, compresses it, and it stores energy, and then you relax the muscles, and it releases it and just springs the wings back up. So that's why you don't need a muscle once you're flying, because you just use the bouncing of this wishbone in the center of the body that can hold the wing power, pop them up, hold it down, pop it up like this. But you need this muscle in order to fly. And when you see a bird all together here, you can see all of these things. So you've got the tail wiggling in flight, moving to help the bird maneuver. You got the very stiff body here. You got the tiny eye. You've got the shoulder and then the elbow down here and the wrist up here. So this is the hand here, right? This is the forearm here. And then the breast muscles pulling it down right here onto the keel. So you can see all of the things we just talked about right there, shaping what we're seeing in the real world. And when you look at birds, underneath all the feathers, you realize that there's a lot going on with the skeleton. And but the core principle of what we're seeing here is that everything in the skeleton is all about reducing weight, being very light, and being very rigid, so that energy from muscles is transferred into flight instead of fighting the movement of your body. You want your body to be very rigid so that there's a clear transmission of energy from wing to movement. And so this is a very elegant design that birds have come up with. And this is what's going on underneath the surface. So that is the talk.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
That was great. If anybody has any questions, we can absolutely take them now. And feel free to either drop them in the chat and I can read them aloud. Or if you are comfortable with coming off mute and asking your question, go ahead and do that as well. Mm-hmm. Oh, we've already got one. Frank asks, when a bird's wings get clipped, is that a forever procedure? If not, how long will it take to generate and be able to fly again? Oh, that's a great question. So what I mentioned is the word clipping, you could call it clipping. When you clip the tips of the primary feathers at the ends of the hands, bird can't fly. It loses the propellers. And that's a complex aerodynamic thing of what moves the bird forward as the wings come down. But that only would, if you're just clipping the tips of the feathers, that's only going to last as long as the bird has those feathers. And birds tend to molt once a year or so, sometimes twice a year. So when they molt again, they're going to come in with a new set of feathers that would be full. You're not hurting the bird permanently because a feather is dead tissue. Does everyone know what feathers are made out of? Feathers are made out of the same thing as your fingernail. So basically, it's just like clipping your fingernails. You're not hurting anything. You're not killing any tissue. It's just dead tissue.
And the breakdown of dead tissue is what creates the keratin that makes feathers and makes fingernails. So you're not hurting anything. It's just you're impairing its aerodynamic ability temporarily. But great question.
All right. Mary asks, so why is the eye mostly covered?
That's a great question. So I don't have my slides right here, but remember the eyeball is this massive thing. And what I imagine is that if a bird hits something or runs into something, those big eyeballs would just fall out. So the ring is seated on top of it and holds it in place and keeps it stationary. I think it's a solution for that, because that little bird could not be flying around with these massive eyeballs, especially in the impactful world of flying when you're hitting things and running into things. The purpose of the big eye is to bring in tons of light, tons of information, so the bird can move in space and make very quick decisions in space. But you don't need to have that entire eyeball exposed. You just need a window for the light signals to come in and bring the messages in. And so that's an elegant solution. You have the ring. It just keeps it in place and locks it down, holds it down. The skin is attached to it, and that ring just sits on the eyeball and pulls it in and holds it there. So I think that that's probably the answer. Great question.
Kevin asks, do raptors have a gizzard since they don't eat seeds and prey is more flexible?
Great question. Well, how about a hummingbird? I mean, hummingbirds don't even eat seeds at all or anything like that. So the gizzard is scaled to the diet of the bird. It responds to the diet of the bird and the bird's dietary needs. The gizzard is most important for birds that eat hard things like seeds and nuts, grains, and they need a way to break it down and digest it. And so birds that are seed eaters have the biggest, most powerful gizzards, and then it's scaled accordingly. All birds have gizzards, but the size and the power of it is scaled accordingly to the diet. So even like a hummingbird that's drinking nectar from flowers, they also eat a lot of insects, and insects have hard exoskeletons. So they need some kind of gizzard to do some breaking up, but a hummingbird cannot afford to be carrying around rocks. And then like in the case of a raptor or an owl, they swallow their food, they digest all the soft tissue, and then they cough up the pellet of bones and feathers and hairs and stuff. So they don't need to break that down. They're separating it before it goes through their system and then coughing it up and getting it out of the way. So yes, a raptor would have a gizzard, but it's not doing what it would for a seed-eating bird.
Renee asks, do tail feathers regenerate if they are pulled on and fell out?
Yes, same with the clipping. So birds are going to be molting a couple times a year. They cannot just grow something back. The molting is a built-in cycle. And so birds lose feathers all the time. Like there's a number of small birds, especially, that have what's called a fright molt. So if something jumps out and tries to grab them, they shed a bunch of feathers and fly out and leave feathers in the mouth of the attacker. So this basically, in their fear, they just drop feathers and leap away, and whatever attacked them ends up with a mouthful of feathers. So birds are losing feathers frequently with things like that. It might get caught somehow. They might be fighting. It might just get a damaged feather for some other reason. And so those kinds of things are replaced when they molt. You'll see hawks or vultures flying around all the time that are missing feathers. So birds can be lacking feathers. It's not critical. And they can still fly just fine. So they just tolerate it until the feathers molt back in, but they can't force it. It's not like it starts growing back as soon as they lose it. I like that question.
Mary asks, where do birds usually roost at night? I don't usually see them in trees.
Oh, well, they do. You have to go out at night. They roost in whatever works in their environment. I mean, say you're out in the sagebrush flats, birds are not roosting in trees. They couldn't just fly to the nearest trees in the sagebrush flats. They just hunker down in the middle of shrubs. And they do that in other areas where it's shrubby. If they're in a grassland area, they would squat on the ground in the dense grasses, sleep on the ground. If they're near water, birds will sleep on the surface of water. In cliffs, birds will sleep in hollows in the cliffs. And then you have birds like swifts. They're relate like swallows, and swifts will go up in the air and circle all night on autopilot and sleep on the wing. So birds have different ways of sleeping, but I think that the vast majority of birds that we see on a daily basis sleep in trees at night. And, like for instance, I don't know if you have an area there where the crows come in at night, where you'll have hundreds of crows all flying in at night, landing in trees and going to sleep in trees. So, but usually we're not out in the tops of trees with flashlights at night looking, but sometimes when you're hiking with a headlight, you'll spook a bird out of a bush or something that's sleeping.
Oh, Renee is telling a story about a hummingbird flew into my house last week, and I was able to get it out. But at one point, I did grab its tail feathers to try and direct it to go through an open window. I ended up with a tiny pile of tiny feathers.
There you go. Probably the fright molt. And like I have birds at a feeder or two coming in, and you will sometimes see birds with no tails at all. They look pretty goofy, and they can still fly. They're not as good, but that doesn't kill them, doesn't hurt them. They just lose some flying ability until their tails molt back in. So I worked on a side note, I worked in a bird feeder store, like Wild Birds Unlimited, if you have one of those there, but not the exact same business, a wild bird feed store. And people would come in with the goofiest story. And this lady came in and she showed pictures of this. One year she brought the hummingbird feeders in at the beginning of winter to take them down so the birds would migrate, and the hummingbirds followed her into the house and kept drinking from the feeders. So she thought, well, maybe I'll just take care of them. So she started buying fruit flies and raising fruit flies and had hummingbird feeders up, and the hummingbirds lived in her house all winter long. Every day she would take a jar of fruit flies, take the top off in the middle of her living room table, and they would come in and dart back and forth and eat fruit flies and then drink nectar the rest of the day. And then they left in the spring and went back outside. And then the next year they flew back in with her again and did it again. They wanted to do that. Not that it's advisable, but it was just such a great story.
The dedication of raising fruit flies for your birds. I have a fruit fly infestation happening right now from some bad soil, and I guess I wish I had some hummingbirds. Yeah.
Well, that's delightful. I mean, just imagine sitting on your couch and then opening the jar and then having hummingbirds go back and forth right in front of you, eating fruit flies out of the air. And once they're used to it, they'll do it every day with you, and then they live off the nectar too. So it was just a delightful image in my mind. I've never forgotten it.
Absolutely, I agree. John asks, buzzard gizzards, how are they different?
That's funny. I was just thinking about turkey vultures. So buzzard gizzards, how are they different? That is a very specific question. I don't know the answer to that one. I'm thinking about what they eat. So, I mean, a vulture is eating decomposing flesh. So there's almost nothing it has to like grind up with a gizzard. So I don't think they would have much of a gizzard. So, and I was just thinking about vultures because working in the same store, someone else came in with another great story. And they put up a big feeder in their backyard, a big platform of plywood, and they would pick up roadkills and put it on the platform, and they had a vulture feeder in their backyard. And they did it every day. They would go out and pick up roadkills and feed vultures in their backyard. Like everyone else comes in, like they're like, oh, I got these little sparrows and I love feeding my toadies and stuff. They're like, I love my vultures. I feed them dead meat.
Oh my gosh.
People are so funny.
Wow. I always say that people who love birds are very unique people, not in a bad way at all.
Not in a bad way.
They have the greatest stories, in my opinion.
And not us at all. We're normal.
Yeah. Kevin says, great talk combining engineering and bird anatomy. Do birds like woodpeckers have any adaptation to protect their heads when hammering on a tree?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they have special cushioning around their brains so that the impact of hitting wood over and over again cushions their brain so it doesn't destroy their brain. Um, I'm trying to remember, there was a news story about it recently that they actually discovered something new about that, but I can't remember that right now. But basically, they have to cushion their brain from the impact of just, what is it, several times a second hitting wood with an incredible amount of impact, like a jackhammer level of impact on their head, and it would just destroy their brain unless they cushioned it in some way. So so I think that was the question, right? Or other modifications they have. I mean, so woodpeckers basically, one of the things they do is, I mentioned birds have 3 toes forward, 1 toe back. Woodpeckers have 2 toes forward, 2 toes back, which enables them to grab onto trees and use their feet as the fulcrum point to build up strength to hit wood. And so basically they're pivoting off a different foot arrangement that gives them a really strong grip on the bark. And then they can grab on, and then they just swing their whole body against the tree and hit the wood really hard. So that's another modification that woodpeckers have. Another one with woodpeckers too. So it's okay, I'm going off here on these things. This is so fun. I'll stop at 8. Another thing that
of
woodpeckers
course.
have that's very cool. So when a woodpecker is pounding on a tree, what is it trying to do? It's trying to find bugs, mostly larvae inside the wood, right? So it's pecking on a tree, uncovers the entrance to a burrow, and the grub is buried deep in the wood. So a bird can't like keep chipping away wood to try to get to the hidden grub. What it does is has a very long tongue that sticks way out past its bill. And at the end of the tongue, it's barbed like a harpoon. The tongue comes out, spears the grub deep in the burrow, and he pulls it out of the burrow, and then it eats it, right? Okay, that's great. But then where does that tongue go? So it's got this, got this long tongue way past the beak. It pulls it in, and where does it go? They don't go down the throat. They don't curl it up. They don't fold it up in the side of their mouth or anything like that. They have a hole in the back of their skull. The tongue comes straight in through the hole in the back of the skull, goes up over the top of the skull, and their tongue sits between their eyes. And there's a groove in the skull under their skin, and that's where the tongue sits, is right here between their eyes. And then when they need it, muscles pull it down around the head through the hole and shoot it out, and it spears the food and pulls it back in. Pretty significant modification for woodpeckers.
Wow. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I always thought they were cool. I didn't know they were that cool.
Oh, yeah.
We have time. Oh, perfect. I was going to say we have time for just a few more questions. John asks, how does air density / elevation / oxygen affect flight and breathing?
Wow. Well, that's a hard question. Let's see. Well, birds have to respond to that a lot. So another thing is, like when a bird is migrating, it can fly continuously for a day, 2 days. It can fly 10 hours, 12 hours continuously. It's not able to drink. So they have to think about the moisture in the air. They have to think about how thick the air is that they're flying through, because if they stay close to the ground, the air is going to be thicker, so they want to get up high. They have to think about the turbulence of air as the air is flowing across the landscape and hitting mountain ranges and bouncing around. And in the daytime, the air is being heated by the sun and rising and is very turbulent. And so the bird has to factor all of these things in on a daily basis when it's flying around, and then also when it's migrating, probably even more important when it's migrating, because in the daytime, a bird is just mostly doing just short flights, even tree to tree. They're staying on their territory. They're just moving around the bits of their territory. But in migration, when they're moving hundreds and hundreds of miles, even thousands of miles, then the equation of air density, air temperature, air humidity, turbulence, all of these things are really important. And they think that that's the reason why birds migrate at night, because at night the air is moister. It's more stratified because there's no sun heating the surface, and so it's easier for them to fly up, pick the layer out of all the layers there. They can pick the layer they want and then just go horizontally through that layer that suits what they need at that moment in terms of density, speed, humidity, temperature, and all of those things. They can go higher or lower, finding the right zone that they want and then just stay in that and go and go and go. But they don't do that in a normal day. They're just doing short, really brief flights. So those factors wouldn't matter. Great question. Jeez.
All right. Do we have any last questions popping in? Okay. Well, we're going ahead and close it out for the evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, David, for taking the time to speak with us. And we're so looking forward to the rest of the talks in this series.
Thank you.
I just want to remind everybody that Friends of Nevada Wilderness is a membership-based organization. Over 80% of donations that we receive go directly to advocating for wilderness protection, restoring habitat for wildlife, and maintaining hiking trails. We'd love for you to become a member and join us in keeping Nevada wild and beautiful. Next month, I will not be your host, as I will be off on our biggest stewardship event of the year for our Southern Nevada office called Alternative Spring Break. So our Northern Nevada programs coordinator, Olivia Wolf, will be the host. She's popped in right there. So please make sure to give her a warm welcome next month. And yeah. Lastly, remember that we hold the Wild Speaker Series every first Thursday of the month with various outdoors topics. Make sure to tune in on March 2nd to listen to David talk about bird feathers and their unique colors. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the link to that page in the chat right now if you are curious and want to take a look and register a bit early. But with that, I think we will go ahead and close it out for the evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you
nice
for
night.
your effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you.